It's the biblical
Yeah.
times.
So
Yeah.
if there was like a pot of coffee up there, I would be great.
So Dennis talked with Brandon, says he's still doing chemo treatments.
I think he's about to start. Didn't he get? I saw a Facebook post where he's like getting reevaluated, or like he's changing his treatment or something. Like his doctor told him that they're gonna try something different.
Yeah,
Is that right?
they kind of. Then they have to kind of go back to just doing more chemo before you can get the marrow transplant again. I think that's what happened. Yeah. Yeah, it's a setback, unfortunately, again. So yeah.
Doug Scruggs, I know he said he was recovering. Is he still recovering?
So I did hear Jonah Neal, his grandson, in the youth class the other night. He said that he was starting to move his left arm, which is progress, and so that it's progress is progress, kind of thing. So I think he's on the up and up, but very slow progress.
Yeah.
Do you know about Becky or Edith? No,
I think Edith's condition's kind of been the same. She's in that assisted living facility. Bev Key, I haven't heard a further update. I know that her most recent treatment went very well, but she's continuing to get more. Yeah, that's all I know.
Anyone we need to add or any other updates on making low?
I think at this point, Jeff is pretty well recovered. Nikki, I think her dad already had the procedure and went well, and they already went back home for that funeral. So those are some of the both of those right there are old. Yeah, you can take those off. Yeah. And I just talked to David this morning, and he said that he has knee replacement surgery scheduled for like maybe about a week and a half away now. So there's that, and then Brendan's not here.
So as far as my friend Sarah, she talked to my mom this morning. She said that Sarah's son is doing better. I'm not sure if he found a new liver or if he's just recovering or is he in a good state right now, but it is on the upward trend as far as right now. So still keep Sarah's son in your prayers. I also have another friend, Michael. He is dealing with, I guess to say the least, without getting too into it, commitment issues from his girlfriend. So they're going through some problems right now. So just keep him in your prayers. Pray for strength for him and guidance. And we're trying to talk to him and help him through it. So keep him in your prayers. Anyone else we need to add? Anyone think of?
My aunt, Anne, A-N-N-E, Frazier, F-R-A-I-S-E-R. She had a co-worker pass away, so it's really their family, but I don't know his name. And it was not good. He collapsed at work, and she did CPR, and he didn't make it.
Anyone else? Okay. I'll leave some prayer for sick and affirm. Dear God, be with us today as we gather in Bible class to take on another portion of your word. Please be with those who we've mentioned on our sick list. Please be with those who are going through treatments, those who have those scheduled, those who have lost co-workers and loved ones, those who are going through infirmities, and their children are going through infirmities. Be with us as long as we're sick. Help us to keep you at the center of our life. Help us to focus on you and to always put you first in our lives and to make it to heaven and bring as many people as we can. In Christ's name. So, last week, Brandon opened up Esther with a sort of introduction and did chapter 1. I'm going to do a small recap, like a previously on Esther, kind of like TV show. So, just a little synopsis for introduction of the Book of Esther. It says, it's a unique book. Like we mentioned, it never mentions God outright, although we see that his presence is implied most duly through Mordecai's allusion to divine providence. We'll see in chapter 4. We made note last week that this book seems rather worldly, secular, so just with a lot of historical accounts regarding its, I guess, position within the Bible. And its purposes are not always explicitly stated, but it's a lot of imagery that are delivered through the story as a whole. So as a timeline of Esther, I'm not sure, I don't think Brandon covered this, but as far as situating it between Nehemiah and Ezra, books we've not recovered, but teached. So like in 540 BC is where Cyrus decrees the Jews to be released. Then we see in 500 BC where Xerxes reigns in Persia, and Azure disposes Vashti. So that's where we currently are. So, and then Esther becomes queen in 40 BC, and this is situated between Nehemiah building the walls in 440. So we're between Daniel and Nehemiah as far as, I guess, terms of lineage. Let's see. So as far as a small outline of the book so far, we may mention that the first thing to note is that the replacement queen we talked about how Vashti was dethroned by the king for refusing his order. She angers the king, then the king makes a decree. And now we pick up a search for a new queen, and Esther becomes queen. So, something to note before we get into Esther is, like we may mention, the background, kind of like the historical context of it. So, let's see. So, in Esther, it jumps forward. Kaufman's commentary adds a few good details to the book. So, it tells us that Ezra 2:16 tells us that Esther becomes queen and serves Xerxes in the 2nd year. And as the great feast is mentioned in the previous chapter, it was his 3rd year, Esther 1:3. So we've jumped 4 years in the timeline from chapter 1 to chapter 2. So during this time period, historically, Xerxes fights in the Grecian War. Most of that we know by the 300 we talked about. We may mention of Spartans and Athens, them fighting the Persians. So that campaign was a disaster, as we can look back and see. For Xerxes, he was defeated at sea by the Athenians and by the Spartans on land, and lost many ships, lost many men, and was utter defeat for him. The bulk of the Persian army was destroyed. And after Xerxes returned to Persia, we see that he was very shameful of his defeats, and most likely indulged within his harem with many women, and probably drank, as we see chapter 1. So that's just a little bit of background we see going into chapter 2 of the historical context. Does anyone want to read just the first 7 verses? If not,
I go.
okay.
Go.
Chapter 2.
Yes.
Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners of every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. And let the beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died.
Okay, so we see in this first 7 verses of chapter 2, we see the more so the aftermath of, I would say his wrath was more kindled towards his recent defeat and humiliation to the public spirit of countries around him. It could also be towards Vashti, I thought at first, but upon my reading some of the commentaries, I think would be more leaning towards his recent defeats against the Greeks. The Covenant commentary details it as such that Xerxes, after the campaign, began to seek a more normal pattern of living, and there was a suggestion that the king desired to reinstate Vashti, but since he had signed the decree, he couldn't do so, which we kind of see that, I thought in chapter 1, where he didn't want to make the decree, but once he had made it, he couldn't take it back. So we see that Xerxes had decrees that for all young women to be taken to the capital, Susa, and then for him to select, I guess, another queen. One thing that I thought was interesting was comparing the versions of chapter 2, just the first verse. There's some other verses that we could bring out as well. But in talking about the wrath and the anger of Xerxes, most commentaries state that once the king Ahasuerus had abated, or once he got over being angry, some versions say once his anger was pacified, which this brings out a note I wanted to just, I guess, throw out there for discussion is how active do you think Xerxes was as a king? Because at times we see, with many other kings in the Bible, the influence of their nobles or of their close servants and advising the king to the best or to the worst, to the detriment. So I just wanted to make note of that it's something to keep note of King Xerxes as we go through this text. Is he acting more so as an active king, or is he more passive in letting others make judgment for him, saying for him to make these laws?
I mean, clearly he wanted to do something after Vashti refused to come, so he consulted, these wise men, as they're called in Esther chapter 1. We see that he definitely had sway and influence over how he was to do it, but the thing I'm getting at is I think clearly he wanted to do something. He didn't consult him for no reason at all. He didn't have to consult him in the first place. So he was already like, okay, I need to do something now. But they clearly had a lot of influence, it appears, over what decision he arrived to. So.
Yeah, if you jump down to verse 21 of chapter 1, it says, "This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed." So you could see he was listening to other people, and he's like, "I like that," and then this is what we're going to do. So I agree with Jeffrey.
Okay, and then scooting down to the next couple of verses. we see, verses 2 through about 4, we see where the decree is sent out to all of the provinces or satraps, and something that Kaufman made commentary on was talking about the horror of being taken from your home and not being able to do anything about it, whether it was a honor or not, just being taken away at a young age, and the fact that these young women had no say in it, because
It says young.
Yeah, like how young?
I don't know how young. Not the commentary.
Probably
uses,
12.
I mean, would it be indicative
Probably
of
12.
like when they married off young women in biblical times, that they were 12 to 14?
Yeah,
Most likely.
that's what I'm saying.
These are
Like,
children.
Yeah.
they've hit puberty, but they're young.
Yeah, so like, that was something that was brought out. I had not thought about that before, but now that it resonates and it makes sense
It's
because
trafficking.
yeah.
Sorry.
And-
I'm passionate about the topic.
No, I mean you're right because what is it? They were placed in a harem and that's where they resided.
Yeah.
That's until called upon. If they were.
I'll say it's hard to know. It certainly wouldn't surprise me because of history that, yeah, it could be that young. We do see, like, in verse 7, it seems like the description of Esther describes someone who's more of older age than I would say the young. Yeah,
Which
beyond
could still
the
be
age.
12, 13.
Me, in theory, but I think the description is definitely more indicative of older than
I
that.
hope
Just
so.
for her, at least, but, you know.
But like we've all said, there's no option. They're
Yeah, they're demanded.
they're gathered, and you can't say no. You're going.
Like guards
This
come
is
to
for
your
the
house and
king.
just
Yeah.
take you.
Also, it's like when you can kind of tell, it's like we talked about before, it's a little bit of a shallow vein through the whole thing. It's just like about physical appearance and beauty and
I
treatment.
really
Like
try to make myself look
it
good.
doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like they're really like, you know, he's spending a lot of quality time to see who he's most compatible with. You know, it's not really that kind of thing.
No.
It's not the bachelor.
No.
And something else that I don't know how true this is, Jeffrey, but one of the commentaries suggests that. Which one is it? Oh, well, let's read. That's actually in the net, so I'll say it in a second. But 8 through, let's go through 18.
I just want to point something out. Do you mind if I say something? In verse 5, I think this is kind of interesting. We're studying 1 Samuel at JCA, and it says that Mordecai was a Benjaminite. What I think is interesting about that is, I never really thought of this, but throughout the story we see that, spoiler alert, but Mordecai, he's pretty brave. Like, he goes out of his way to protect Esther and stuff. If you read 1 Samuel, it's like chapter 8, I think, when Saul is just his average Joe. He's just looking for his dad's donkeys, and then all of a sudden Samuel comes up and he's like, we're going to choose you to be king, right? Then they have this whole deal. Saul's from Benjamin, from the tribe of Benjamin. And when you read in chapter 8, it's like in the middle, somewhere around like verse 20 or something, it says, now Benjamin was the smallest of all the tribes. And then other versions say Benjamin was the humblest of the tribes. When Saul was announced to be king, Samuel was like, where's Saul? All right, we're going to choose Saul to be king. He was hiding somewhere, like when he was initially being king. And that showed you like what the tribe of Benjamin was known for. Was they were humble, they were a small clan, they didn't want to be out there in front of people, different things like that. But then when we read about Mordecai, I don't think any of us would have thought that he came from, like that shy tribe. It doesn't seem like he came from that. But we can kind of see that, his relationship with Esther obviously compelled him to, put himself out there. But I just thought that was an interesting thought of him being from the tribe of Benjamin.
Yeah,
As we
that's a
read
good
throughout
one.
the
I like
story.
that. Yeah, you definitely see, as we go through towards the end of this chapter, and definitely later on, his bravery and definitely loyalty to Esther. All right, so does anyone want to get 8 through 18 really quick? If not, I can read it.
So it came about when the command and decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the custody of Haggai, and that Esther was taken from the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the woman. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and food, gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not make it known to her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. Every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Now, when the turn of each young lady came to go to the king Ahasuerus, after the end of the 12 months under the regulation for the woman, for the days of their beautification were completed as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and cosmetics for women. The young lady would go to the king in this way. Anything that she desired was to be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not again go into the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Now, when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, came in to go to the king, she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the woman, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tebeth, in the year of his reign. Through 18.
Yes, please.
Okay. The king loved Esther more than all the women. She found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all the princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty.
Okay, so we see in these next 10 verses, we see that the king calls upon each of the women as he had desired. We see that Esther, we see the little phrase of found favor and grace. So we see that she is made queen above all the rest. There was something that made note that suggests that in verse 8, that when the king's commanded decree was heard, many young women were gathered. Then it says that also Esther was taken to the king's palace into the care. Something suggests that maybe she resisted going to it, but there was no biblical evidence that there was a delay. So I thought that was interesting that it brought it out, but immediately dismissed it. Another thing that is brought out is when it is Esther's turn to go to the king in verse 12, after she had completed 12 months preparation according to the regulations, 6 months of that, 6 months of that. I don't know how it is known, but it says that she went during the winter time when she went to go see Xerxes. And that the story gives no hint of more judgment about the actions of her or what she did to prepare herself, but the fact that more intriguing is that the fact of God's working through another divine conscience at this time, since she was a Jewish virgin and he was a pagan king. So you see God's handiwork during this time, even though he's not explicitly stated as we mentioned. And then we see another feast, which it seems like he makes a bunch of these, but for all of his officials and servants, once again, making a holiday and giving gifts according to the generosity of the king. So we see that once Esther is made queen, we see that a feast is made. Which one thing I wanted to bring up, but I don't know if there's any background to it, was Vashti at this point. Do we know anything
No,
about
I mean,
her whereabouts?
I read a little bit on the history of this time, and some people think that after Esther, she became queen again, like in the future, but like we don't know. And so, but I mean, she clearly, as I mentioned before, like I mean, she wasn't sentenced to death or anything like that, so she was still around some capacity, but we don't know what that was. So, yeah.
He abducted these girls for 12 months.
Well, did they need to go back home
It
afterwards
doesn't sound like
either?
it.
Did
No,
they?
6 months of.
It says they got transferred to the
Yeah.
They moved from the harem of virgins to the harem of concubines.
Yeah, it does. I don't think it doesn't mention. Yeah, they went from one harem to another, so I don't know if that made them permanent concubines or something like that. But that may have been the case. So
The commentaries I Kaufman and then just the commentary from the Bible I have was that they were permanently in the harems and they stay there unless they were called upon
unless they're.
by the king.
yeah, that's very
So
possible.
what about after those 12 months? Like,
It says they were transferred
They
to the
moved
other
to
one,
the concubine
concubine
harem.
one.
Okay, so I guess moving on, I'll read the last couple of verses. So when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Asher or Xerxes, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when the inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the Book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. So here we see Mordecai discovering a plot, and then making a way to add to Alex's point, Mordecai's bravery we see to inform Esther and for her to inform the king, which garners them both favor in his sight. So something that I'm not sure, but a commentary made out that Mordecai's position within the Persian Empire as a possible, like, I guess maybe a lower official or some kind of official for him to be in the capital and to be by the gates. Wasn't sure if there was any credence to that.
Yeah, I have no clue if we have documents on an official position, but clearly, if you're a gatekeeper, like at the royal palace, like you've gone up the ranks in some capacity. So.
And so he uses that to rest of his position. He uses his position to listen in on the plot and expose it. The second thing to bring out in this is that Esther's continuing to conceal her identity as a Jew was vital, as we see what happens later in the story. Because if Haman had known she was Jewish at this time, he could have decided to kill all the Jews, and her being queen could have been maybe not as possible. We also see that it is hard to, it would be incorrect to say that to view any of these events as mere coincidences. They it should be interpreted as God's divine work as he's working through Mordecai at this time and through Esther. And then just like I mentioned earlier, Esther to inform the king in Mordecai's name, and then we see that once again the king's decision to condemn two men is immediately carried out without question. So just wanted to reiterate it wasn't also a decree, but just the power of Xerxes at this time. That is all I have as far as I wanted to bring out. Was there any comments anyone wanted to make or any questions?
One of the things that's notable about Esther, especially like in verse 20, is the fact that she had this really deep respect for Mordecai, and that I think throughout the book, what's interesting is how she was a great respecter of authority. Even the authority of a pagan king, she like that was impressive because obviously he's not the noblest of individuals. But what's so fascinating is it kind of teaches a lesson of those who respect authority end up being an authority, because she ended up becoming a great authority in her own right. And it's interesting to me that at the time, like especially in verse 20, she had just become queen, and yet she's still listening to and taking the advice of Mordecai, who she like ranks higher than already at that point. So I think her respectfulness towards Mordecai and her respecting authority, just like us, we're called by God's word to respect even the authorities of our government, even when they're clearly not always doing the right thing. That's a tough pill to swallow a lot, but she showed respect, and she became a respectable and authoritative person as well herself. So
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's something I should have brought out of Esther's restraint through that we see.
Yeah.
Through the text.
Yeah, a lot of discipline. Yeah.
Yes.
Mordecai was also like basically her father too. I mean,
Yeah.
her parents had died, so you obviously have a pretty close relationship with the person that raised you. So it makes sense that she like would listen to him and respect him because he took her in.
Alright, if anyone doesn't have anything else to I can lead us in prayer.
Oh, actually, I think one thing we didn't discuss was the spending an evening with the king. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's not some. I think it's pretty clear that it seems very likely that it was not a very Christian kind of evening. So based on I mean, we don't.
Is that every woman?
Yeah, I mean, it appears
Well,
that it
Well,
says
then
that it's a
transfer
standard.
to the concubine.
If it's a
Yeah.
harem, then
Yeah, so it's so yeah, that's obviously it was a pagan king, and that seems to have been So,
What's kind of crazy is that like this is after some of the Jewish people were able to return. So like these were ones who chose to stay, and it's kind of telling of just how like, complicated and crazy and how far they'd fallen from like what God had intended for the Jewish society. That there were people who, like, for whatever reason, couldn't or didn't want to or whatever, didn't return home. They'd rather live here, in Persia or in Babylon or wherever the various places they've been displaced to. They're just submitting themselves to society as it is. There were a lot of problems back when they were trying to rebuild the temple, but Nehemiah didn't have a harem. It would have been a better place to raise your kids, despite all of its difficulties. But we have a whole Jewish community here that's, for whatever reason, elected to stay.
It also just kind of blows my mind that she was the queen and he didn't even know like her heritage at all. He didn't know who raised her. Like he clearly didn't know anything about her.
yeah, I think you're right. He didn't.
He
I mean,
did
he
have
knows
to
she
know her
knows
name
nothing.
though, because they can't return unless he calls her by name.
That's true.
So he did know her name.
Hey, yeah,
Yeah,
props.
I got the first name.
The royal artist.
Might have
Yeah.
mixed it up sometimes.
Yeah. Well, they may have had numbers. We don't know.
probably gave him like a card.
Yeah.
Oh, they had like a punch card.
I think it's interesting though, the last verse has some foreshadowing of some things to come in later chapters. Not to be spoilery. Of course, the Holy Spirit knew what we needed, so.
Right.
But talking about hanging on the gallows and recording this in the Chronicles, those are important things later on.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say about going piggybacking to the night, one night with the king, about how just going back to how I guess to Jewish tradition, he definitely wasn't circumcised, and to add to that, he was pagan, so I was just gonna say, to God working through that. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say that Esther, she got a lot of these circumstances were purely beyond her control, and yet to me that's kind of the wonderful thing about the Book of Esther. It shows that even when your circumstances are sometimes beyond your control, God can make good out of your difficulty circumstances and do something even amazing through them. And we see that Esther, though born and raised into difficult circumstances, she turned that into being a critical piece in God's great plan to preserve the Jewish people. So it's like
Exactly, like the king isn't exactly the role model, but Esther definitely is. I mean,
right.
she
Right.
is.
Agreed.
Well, I guess I'll close this out in prayer and then we can be dismissed. Dear God, thank you for this day again. Thank you for the blessings that you give to us every day. Thank you for the safety you give us and being able to come together and just praise you through songs and pray to you in prayer and to listen to your word. Help us to take the lessons we hear throughout our lives. Help us to apply them. Help us to delve in your word daily. Help us to bring those who are lost to you and those who have lost their way. Forgive us of our sins. Help us to always be quick to repent and to be quick to return to your word. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.